With rejoicing in our hearts, lifted by that music, we recall that this is a holy and beautiful custom that brings us together. Here we face our ideals, where we remember our loved ones, where we give thanks, we even make confession, we offer forgiveness, we come to be enlightened and to be strengthened in the deep and dark times of our lives, because we know that in this hour breathes the worship of ages, the cathedral music of history. We also know that three unseen guests attend: faith, hope, and love. Let our hearts then prepare them place. Did that wake you up? Did that rouse you? Well, now it's your turn to do the same thing as we sing a great old hymn, and it's great and old because it has power yet today. Shall we join together in hymn number 278 in your gray hymn book?
Praise
This being February, it is also Black History Month, which, as someone observed long ago, is the shortest month. So once again, we are not giving a community its due, but we will do what we can. In worship, we will do this through the words of poets and authors who come from that community and speak from it. Today we read from the work of Maya Angelou, and I'd like you to join me in reading responsively. We, unaccustomed to courage, exiles from delight, live coiled in shells of loneliness until love leaves its high holy temple and comes into our sight to liberate us into life. If we are bold, love strikes away the chains of fear from our souls. Love costs all that we are and ever believe. Yet it is only love which sets us. A brave and startling truth. It is possible and imperative that we discover a brave and startling truth. Wisdom to keep through the week, I should think. Good morning. My name is Fred Wooden. I am the preacher here at Fountain Street Church. This is one of two services that goes on each and every Sunday from September through May, into June, I should say. And you are at the second. The earlier one is at 9:30 in our chapel. We have many faces. We have many names, but we are of one heart. Fountain Street Church has been a pioneer in exploring the limits of spirituality and the dangers of liberalism in all of its forms for 150 years. And you are part of it this year as we are entering into our 150th year celebration. Please take note of it as you see posters all over the church, and please stick around after church to visit with each other and to learn more about us. I wish particularly to say you need to be here next Sunday. If not for worship, then certainly in the afternoon when pianist, I'm looking at this to get this just right, Xavier Davis, notable jazz pianist, will be here in this room playing on that piano, making more beauty happen in a few minutes than most of us can fathom. And it is there for you. So we didn't have quite enough of these to go in every worship or order of worship, so I'm holding it up so you can see it, and I will be glad to pass it along to anyone else who wishes to come. That's the most important announcement. That, and thank you for being here today. In the first Sunday of February, the very dead center of winter. Aren't you brave? And now, let me withdraw and let other music take center stage. Readings are other voices from other times, whose words still speak to us today, whether we have heard them or not. All this year, I am using these hours to focus on the complicated, difficult, challenging, and profound work that is that of Paul of Tarsus and the letters that are contained in the Christian scriptures. Much of what he says has shaped who even we are. I'm beginning a little look into the second letter that is sent to the church in Corinth, and I'll have big problems with that later, but I'll give you a sample now. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God, not that we are competent of ourselves to claim anything as coming from us. Our competence is from God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of letter, but of spirit. For the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Bertolt Brecht, the great playwright of the 20th century, in his piece on the life of Galileo, writes, "The aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error." And because this week is the birthday not only of Abraham Lincoln, but of Charles Darwin, born on the very same day in the same year, and since he's up there looking at least up toward the bell choir, if not at you and me, this one sentence: "To kill an error is as good a service as, and sometimes better than, the establishing of a new truth." And here, curiously, from one of the early fathers of the Christian church, Irenaeus of what is now called Lyon, "Error indeed is never set forth in its naked deformity, lest being thus exposed it should at once be detected. But it is craftily decked out in an attractive dress, so as by its outward form to make it appear to the inexperienced more true than truth itself." With those vexing little quotes, we turn to the offering. If you were not here when I gave the announcements just before we began, there's an occasion in the room 109 in our basement where we are honoring and supporting Family Promise, one of several organizations here and certainly around the state and the country, devoted to meeting the challenge of homelessness. Family Promise is devoted to families, obviously, often single parents with 1, 2, or more children that have no place to live, and especially in the winter to make sure they are not out in the cold. And you may read about them in the news. They're making great strides in housing families. We have worked with community rebuilders. We have worked with Dégagé Ministries. We have worked with Habitat for Humanity, Go Build Guild, and all those good things, and yet homelessness persists. We all remember the story, I'm sure we remember it here, of the Dutch boy putting his finger in the dike and realizing there would always be more holes than fingers. There's another story I like to tell about the two fishermen. You've heard this one. I'll repeat it, though. It bears repeating. It's a parable. Standing out in the river. Charlie, you know what I mean, up in your hip waders. He's a fisher person. So is George. George, you guys go fly fishing, right? Like in streams that are rushing cold, and you have your hip waders, and you're casting. And the story is two guys are out there casting, and around the bend of the river they see an object that isn't a fish. And it takes them a moment to realize it's a baby in a basket, and it's not Moses. But being good men, one of the fisher people pulls it out, and lo and behold, directly around the bend comes another. And as they spy up the river, they see several more, all staged along about every 30 or 40 yards. At which point they realize their fishing has come to an end. But one of the fishermen wades off to the shore and starts walking upward. He said, "Bill, you got to come back. I got to take these babies out before they drown." He said, "Yeah, but I'm going to go stop the guy from throwing them in the first place." Ultimately, our task is not merely to provide mercy for those suffering, but to seek the causes of suffering that can be stopped. Homelessness has an answer. It has several answers. So I want you to do this stuff for all the children. I want you to do this stuff for all those who are homeless, who visit us on Sundays. Greetings to our friends in the social hall and the mezzanine. But more than that, we should be asking, what can we do so that it doesn't have to exist in the first place, and should we not speak to that? I know it's difficult for churches to do that because it means some people will be unhappy with what you say. If being unhappy with what I said changed what I said, I would have said a lot of things differently by now. But the error that looks like truth is that we are stuck with homelessness. That's an error. We are not. So why am I telling this before the offering? So you do give money and then say, I'm tired of pushing out babies with dollar bills. I want to stop having to do it altogether. And if you're interested in that, come talk to me. But we still have to fish the babies out. Remember, only one fisherman went up the river, the other one stayed. So for all of us who are staying here at this end of the river to fish out the babies, your offering will now be most gratefully received. Give money, make music, let's make it happen. See you later. Sorry, Charlie, I'm going to refer to you twice. Charlie and I bumped into each other in the backstage area, if you want to call it that. It used to be called the vestry, sacristy, whatever you call it. And asked how we were, and knowing that Charlie had a history, a medieval history major, I asked him, are you feeling sanguine today? There was a theory in early Western medicine derived from the Greek physician Galen that health was the balance of 4 fluids that rode through your body. Remember, they didn't have much knowledge. All they could see was what you put in and what came out. And they believed that you needed a balance of blood, 2 different kinds of bile, and phlegm. Who wants to be a physician in that world? At any rate, they all had names because each fluid had a certain temperament that attached to it. If you were ruddy complected, you had plenty of blood, and you were cheerful. So you were sanguine, which comes from the word blood. Cheerful, upbeat. If, on the other hand, you had a lot of phlegm, and you were kind of glum, you would be considered phlegmatic, which means that you don't have much to say, and you're kind of. If on the other hand you had too much black bile, that would mean you were cross and miserable, and you would be called choleric. And if you had too much yellow bile, it meant that you were tended to be rather gloomy and withdrawn, and you were called melancholic. Now, I don't know that that theory still holds, but it was observed that people have different temperaments. That was an observed reality. The assignment of cause was bad science. The observation. I mean, I know which one I basically am. Do you know which one you are? Are you sanguine, cheerful, amiable? Are you irenic or choleric? I think our president has got a lot of black bile, if you ask me. Are you phlegmatic, which means you have little to say and don't think anyone should say much at all? Are you melancholic? That would be me. And physicians tried to balance those things. Of course, they balanced them by telling you to eat or drink this, or they would get you to eliminate, or they would, if you had too much blood, they would give you a leech to suck it out, or they give you an emetic, so you would, well, never mind. Why is this a prayerful moment? Because, like it or not, we are none of us so perfectly balanced in our humors that we can be at ease at every moment. And I want to suggest to you that a proper prayer is not to be balanced or serene, but to be at home in who you are and see that as a gift, as a superpower when you put it in the right place. You can't do everything, but you could probably do a few things really well. So with that in mind, let's go inward enough so that we can ask that question. Ancient Spirit, whether you exist or not, we reach our hearts and minds out into a universe that seems inert and hope that something out there knows we are present. And so we'll talk about you as if you exist with the hope that something is listening in a way that matters. Who of us can claim to stand equally on both feet, to see with both eyes and hear with both ears? Are we not all tipped to one side? Are we not all, to some extent, struggling with too little of one and too much of another? And do we not all wish we had more of this or less of that? To be different in some way that would make us more whole or more happy. It's hard then to ask, to wonder, whether or not we were made as we should be. Whether or not what we have in all of its imperfection has the seed of a greater perfection in it. If it is my nature to be angry, let me be angry at oppression and injustice. Let me devote that energy towards something greater and better than my own distaste. If I am phlegmatic, let my silence be the prelude to listening, to being present and caring in silence. If I am sanguine, let it be for those moments when fear is about and people need hope, not just for my pleasure and merriment. And if I am melancholic, let it be for things worthy of my grief and of my sorrow, not the small things that belong only to me. Yes, Remind us that our gifts that are sent in unequal measure together make the kaleidoscope of life that sheds light and love and hope beyond us. Make us in our imperfection instruments of a larger perfection. In our incompleteness, make us workers for a greater completeness. And in our struggles, workers for something worth struggling. Upon these things and all that besets us, which is often found only in the presence of silence, we now give ourselves to that prayer. And let our amen be found in music. Gentle tides go rolling by along the salt sea strand. The colors blend and roll as one together in the sand. And often will the winds entwine to send their distant call. The quiet joys of humankind, where love embraces all. Where road and weeds together rise among the common ground. The mare and stallion, light and dark, have thunder in their sound. The rainbow sign, the blended flood, still have my heart enthralled. The quiet joys of what we share, where love embraces all. But we have come to plow the tides, the oat lies on the ground. I hear their fires in the field, they drive the stallion down. The roses bloom both light and dark, the winds do seldom call. The running sands recall the time when love embraces all. What you may not know, the choir did that piece in part to remind us that this is the time when various East Asian cultures are observing what we call New Year. It means the Lunar New Year, and that this month is the prelude to a part of a spring festival. Say spring in February. Well, even here in what we call the West, we have passed midwinter. That was February 1st and February 2nd, which is why Groundhog Day happens then. And when people say, well, why 6 weeks more of winter when we ask this groundhog thing? And it turns out that if you divide winter into half, you have 6 weeks that are in front and 6 weeks. So the groundhog is going to give you 6 weeks more of winter no matter what. It just marks the midpoint in a season. But in Asia, the seasons are reckoned slightly differently, so I'm thankful that the choir brought a flavor of that. We have several tunes in our hymn book that have East Asian composers, and there's some texts as well. Before I begin, I remind you, and remind myself, that we are always beholden to those who have preceded us in this church, whose lives were completed at this time and this year and in other years, and who made this place ready for us today, and for whom we are grateful. And thus we lift up their names in gratitude as we pass the anniversaries of their passing. I lift up the names today of Bob Kriegbaum, of Verna Sanders, of Sam Bacon, and Walter Kepp, and Richard Brooks. El Malei Rachamim, Shekem Berachamim, God filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your Shekinah to the souls of our beloved who have gone to their eternal place of rest. May you, who are the source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally. Bind their souls to you and to we the living, that they may rest in peace, that we may be at peace. And let us say, Amen. Did you ever do those ancestry things, finding your genetic things and stuff and finding out well, I have a famous relative. To be honest, she's married kin, someone who married someone. So not blood kin, and actually they were only married for 4 years. But she kept the married name for the rest of her life, so I'm going to take her. I want you to know that I am related by marriage distantly to Patsy Cline. Her first husband, Gerald Edward Cline, was kin to my great-great-grandmother, who was a Cline from the same city in Winchester, Virginia. So we could be as close as third cousins once removed, which is closer than you think. I actually know some fourth cousins, and I love them a lot. But that's why I keep a CD of Patsy in the car. And on long trips, I crank it up. She was the master of the broken-hearted woman who made Willie Rogers' song Crazy famous. And I Fall to Pieces. And the one from which I derived the title of this sermon, I was so wrong for so long. Why am I talking about apologies today? Because the Apostle Paul, St. Paul, Paul of Tarsus, that guy, owes us, the whole world, a really, really big one. Of course, he's not going to give it. But so far, I have found many places in the works of Paul that were worth pondering, that were misunderstood, that have been so mystical that people twisted them into all sorts of inappropriate shapes. But now, and not for the first time, but most clearly in this letter, this second letter that we have to the church in Corinth, he steps over a line that I cannot accept because of what he says there and elsewhere, sadly. He sets loose a terrible force that over the last 2 millennia has consumed millions of lives. What we call the second letter to the Corinthians is actually a pastiche of as many as 5 letters cut and pasted together after he died. Paul's ideas were so powerful by then that they were shared among early Christian communities as authoritative and eventually inspired. Even writers of later texts would attribute their writings to him, hoping to get the same kind of credit he got. And the Corinthian correspondence, while authentic, is the result of editors, so we're already one step removed. And this community was very vexing to Paul because they kept getting out of line. After he founded it and left, other apostles came through the neighborhood disparaging Paul as being less apostolic, and they were apparently very good at what they did, and they were convincing the Corinthians, who were Gentiles, I should point out, that they had to be Jews if they wanted to be Christians. This was exactly opposite of what Paul was preaching. His message, his experience, was that Christ was sent to the whole world, Jew and Gentile, and if everyone had to be a Jew, it was the misreading of the whole point. And so when this church was on the verge of accepting these other apostles, he was irate, and he struck back very harshly. And that's the context for the passage I heard earlier. But I'm going to go further and show you how it becomes even worse. Let's remember what he said, which I quoted earlier. Such is the confidence we have that through Christ towards God. Not that we are competent of ourselves to claim anything as coming from us. Our competence is from God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of letter, but of spirit, For the letter kills and the spirit gives life. We've all heard that phrase, the letter killeth. Let's go further into it. He continues, and here I'm reading sentences I do not wish to read because they are wrong, but you need to hear them. The ministry of death, chiseled on stone tablets, meaning the tablets of the Ten Commandments. For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, much more does the ministry of justification abound in glory. We act with boldness, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face. Their minds were hardened. Indeed, to this very day, when they hear the reading of the old covenant, the same veil is there, since only in Christ is it set aside. Indeed, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, meaning in a synagogue, a veil lies over their minds, but when one turns to the Lord, meaning Christ, the veil is removed. The term that encompasses all of this is supersessionism. What? Supersessionism is the fancy word that says, my religion is better than yours. Mine replaces yours. Yours was broken. Mine is not. And that is what Paul is essentially saying, that the dispensation, the covenant with Moses was imperfect, inadequate, temporary, and the one with Christ is the law, is the next, the better. It's the new and improved. It is the New Testament, the new covenant. And by the 2nd century, Jewish Christianity, which was the dominant form of it in the 1st century, had been obliterated, largely because the temple had been destroyed and the Romans had destroyed most of Judea. Was all but dead. So what was left was Gentile Christianity, thanks to Paul, and Jews who did not accept Jesus as the Christ. So what began as a movement within Judaism, distaff as might be, then extended beyond it, thanks to Paul, became a movement to replace Judaism with Christianity. That's what supersessionism is about. We're here to replace you. Unfortunately, there were Jews who wouldn't go along. They persisted in being Jewish anyway. Even as Christianity grew and became more and more powerful and more hostile, they refused to go along with the script. And by the time it was granted official status, the church, that is, by the empire, Christianity had congealed this into a doctrine of anti-Judaism that over the centuries grew and spread and became not just anti-Judaism, but a racialized vision of the Jew that attached stereotypes of appearance and behavior well beyond the rejection of Christ and the awful canard of killing Christ. And it all starts here, right here, with a man who was himself as Jewish as it gets. That's not just ironic. Now, I'm not going to engage in some historic psychoanalysis here. That's beyond my pay grade. But clearly, Paul's personal experience as a Jew who experienced a vision of Christ transformed how he saw himself and the community in which he lived. Because if we look at all the letters that are authentic, we see him lifting up Judaism and putting it down, praising it and condemning it. He's clearly conflicted. My best guess, and this is a guess, is that he could not understand how his fellow Jews did not see what he saw. I'm going to break from my text to tell you a funny story because this is getting very heavy. But it illustrates the psychological phenomenon I'm trying to point. I had a colleague, and I know I've told this story before, but after 15 years, I'm out of fresh stories. She was a fellow student at seminary, but she was already a mother, and her son was 7 or 8 years old, and told me, and told us in a group at one of those student meetings we have over coffee and tobacco and things like that, that at one point her son came in and saw her showering in the bathroom. Moment of sexual instruction. "Mommy, you don't have a penis." She said, "No." "Don't you want one?" I think that's the phenomenon Paul was having. Don't you want to be like me? I feel great. Christ is wonderful. Why don't you want to join me? It wasn't hostility. It was, come on in. The water's great over here. No, I don't swim. Well, why they could not grasp. Why could they not grasp that Jesus was the culmination of their faith, the promise set out by the prophets? Don't they get it? Stubborn Jews. I'm not agreeing with Paul here. I just want you to grasp the complexity and the difficulty he's wrestling with that comes forth in this intense hostility to other Christians who are saying, no, the Jewish part is still important. Well, that's a theological argument, but the consequences is the purging of Judaism from Christianity and an eternal hostility between them. So we really cannot blame him directly for what came as a result of it. He did not know his words would be immortalized by generations. He was speaking to those two people in Corinth who were ruining his church. He was irate. He was beyond perplexed. So ultimately, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism is the fault of the church, the whole church, and nothing but the church. Because it overestimated Paul's intent, misunderstood the context, and then used it in the most unchristian of ways. If slavery is the original sin of the American experiment, anti-Semitism is the original sin of Christianity. And most Christian bodies know that now, but it took the Holocaust to wake them up. It took 6 million Jewish lives, not counting the ones that weren't counted in all the pogroms and all the other exterminations. Have you ever been to York, England? Anyone here been to York? Ever been to York Minster? It's a tower right in the middle there. You know why it's famous? Because all the Jews went and hid there hoping that they could escape the most recent purge, and they were wrong. They set it ablaze and they incinerated all the Jews inside. There's a place in Vienna called Judenplatz where they herded them all in medieval times for extermination. It took 1,900 years for Christianity to wake up to its responsibility. And even today, the Roman Catholic Church, the author of so much, has disavowed supersessionism, at least officially. Most mainline Christian bodies, Methodists and others, have explicitly rejected the concept, however way overdue. And one of the places where it persists, at least technically, is in the Reformed tradition, because the Reformed tradition rests on supersessionism, that my covenant is better than yours. But it's also more subtle, because it's no more just about religion. It's about race. It's about culture. We see it in the rise of neo-Nazism, but it goes even deeper. Like white supremacy, most of us don't even see it because it's not about us. Let's take a look. Take a Bible, for example. Look at it sometime. The fact that it's a single volume arranged in 2 pieces, Old and New Testament, is a theological statement. Why? Because there's the Old Testament and the New and Improved Testament. That's what it means. This one is new, which is better than old. It's arranged in a different sequence of books in the Old Testament, as we call it, to lead naturally to the Gospels, so that the entire effect is to say what started in Genesis inevitably, ineluctably, and must result in Christ. Do you not see that the very Bible itself, the way it was written and structured, is to teach you that Jews are yesterday's news? You don't see it until I tell you. It's a little bit like reminding people that the year number is a theological statement. Christian supremacy, something that would better be called Christendom, the dominion of Christ, is pervasive. In European history especially, and because of the imperial age in all the colonies, including us, anti-Semitism is an inevitable result of Christendom, a necessary part of it, and thus part of our lives, whether or not we personally see it or participate in it. But now and then it rears its head, even in most almost innocent ways. 2 weeks ago, some of us from the church were participating in the Martin Luther King worship service at New Hope Baptist Church. We participated as choir members. We love it. It's great fun. And while we are singing very orthodox Christian words, the genuine quality of welcome and support and comradeship is just everywhere. And we don't mind because it's honest and authentic. But something happened this year. I'd like to think it's because it was a white guy who was preaching, but I can't swear to that. But he used the parable of the Good Samaritan to illustrate why racism is bad and why we should all be better. And he dipped his foot right in the middle of leftover anti-Semitism. And I don't think more than 2 people in the room noticed it. I know the other person. Here's the deal. You know the story, the man robbed, left by the side of the road, and along comes a priest and a Levite and then a Samaritan. But the preacher, he said, well, you see, the priest, he couldn't touch him because he was a priest and he would be defiled. That is anti-Semitic because it's wrong. First of all, he wasn't going to Jerusalem, so he was going home. Second, everyone is incumbent, everyone is obliged to help the harmed person, priest, Levite, or otherwise. That's true then and it's true now. It was a stereotype of what Jews won't do and won't help that was taking part, and he didn't even know he was doing it. That's the part. It's like racism. We don't even know when we're doing it. It's so baked in. There's a lot of depth in that story, but what it comes down to, the parable is not about Jews, it's about good people and bad people. And about social status. A priest is at the top of the social ladder. It's not that he's a Jew is a problem, it's just he's all stuck up. Likewise with the Levite. Thinks better of himself. That's not a Jewish problem, that's a human problem. And so when the Samaritan comes along, someone at the bottom of the social ladder, and does the right thing, it upsets our expectations and tells us that the neighbor is not the person that we aspire to be, but the person who will be with us when we need help. It's a great story, but it has been stripped of its Jewishness by being eliminated 1,700 years ago, so now we cannot hear the Jewish context that makes it legitimate as a parable, and instead it becomes a vehicle for anti-Semitism. I won't even go into the part where the prayer that lasted really long, and we all stood up for it and reminded us that the 120 Jews who would not accept Christ, lying again. Anti-Semitism is everywhere. It assigns blame in places it does not belong. It typifies and stereotypes. Now, I wrote a kind, if critical, letter to the pastor. I do not expect to hear back from him. If I do, I'm sure he'll correct me. After all, we are hardly legitimate Christians ourselves. We know what it's like to be on the periphery. But for many of them, though, meaning Pentecostal and other preachers, the idea that their religion created anti-Semitism and legitimated 2 millennia of oppression is impossible to believe. I'm not a racist. I'm not an anti-Semite. And that is perhaps the worst part. Who here remembers the story of Mary Mallon? Good for you. Irish immigrant to America who was, it turned out, an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever. Her only skill was as a cook. And wherever she went and cooked, people got sick. But she refused to believe she was the problem. This is in the days before we knew about microbes. And she was literally quarantined twice to prevent her from spreading the disease. But she never believed it was her fault. Christianity is the typhoid Mary of anti-Semitism. It doesn't even know it's doing it. If it thinks it is, it's purely accidental, coincidence. It has refused to believe it is responsible for the long oppression and the near destruction of an entire race. Not even race, that's the wrong word. A community, a nation, a people, and of faith. The Holocaust and the horror of that experience was what it took to force Christian authority to see part of the truth they had denied. But today, with the last of those survivors approaching death, and they, children at the time, we are also seeing a return of explicit anti-Semitism, Holocaust deniers. It is terrifying and mystifying. There's a new book that I'm going to have to get, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, that documents the return of this disease of the spirit. But it was just a few months ago when I was out of town and my wonderful colleague was able to respond that a man went into Etz Chaim synagogue in Pittsburgh and gunned down old people, because they were Jews. And that's just the most obvious canary in the mine. Do you know what Etz Chaim means? Tree of life. The man was trying to cut down the tree of life. In America, we get the good old-fashioned anti-Semitism attached to the stereotypes of sneaky cabals and globalists and people who are trying to run your lives. But in Europe, we're seeing a brand new version of anti-Semitism, and it is very, very troubling. It comes now in the form of criticism of Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians. Now, I wish to be emphatic that I have grave doubts about the wisdom of the Israeli government and the justice of its policies. But I am not about to go to a synagogue and shoot people on behalf of that political issue. But that is why synagogues in Europe have been assaulted. Whether it is anti-Semitism hiding behind politics or politics that is just too naive to see it as anti-Semitic, the result is the same. There is no time today, and I have not the capacity to go further than saying this phenomenon is real, it will not go away, and religion is not the point, but it is the problem. Anti-Semitism is racism. And the accusation that the Jews are the racists, which is something we hear from time to time, is an evil attempt to blame the victim for the crime they are suffering. By the way, if you ever hear someone talk about the Jews, the blacks, or the gays, you are listening to a racist comment. The attachment of a definite article is a definite proof that the person speaking to you is racist. Ironically, sadly, this has its origin in a small grain of sand that is Paul's frustration and anger about the way he was being treated 2,000 years ago. He was wrong to say it. He was wrong when he pronounced it, but the wrong that follows from it does not belong to him. Yes, it formed around a corrupt pearl around that grain of sand, but it would have shown up somewhere. Christianity is guilty. And I know it will not listen to me any more than my Pentecostal colleague will, but I am still obliged as a preacher in this church to say that it is guilty, it is responsible, and more preachers need to say that as a whole, not just non-Christians, more Christians need to say it, that the whole church in all its forms, Roman, Eastern, Protestant, local and national and international, is responsible for anti-Semitism then and now. It has a moral and a sacred duty. I would say its mission must include defending, protecting the Jewish community, even if you have to put yourself in harm's way. It is not enough to condemn it. They must end it. The same way white people have to end racism in America. Yes, the situation in Israel and Palestine is fraught and hard. There is dirt upon a lot of hands, but that does not excuse Christianity from setting the ball in motion. For it is not just the religion, it's also the imperial age. Because where Israel is now and where Palestine is now was carved up 17 times and most recently by Britain and France and others after the First World War. If you want to know why there's a problem in Israel and Palestine, you should be talking to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope, not just the governments in Israel and Palestine. The politics of today are the result of the religion of yesterday. And our hands are clean. No. We may not identify as Christian anymore, but we are beneficiaries of it. It is like the privilege of being white. It is unearned and undeserved, but it is still ours. So we must be forthright, not only in condemning it, but in resisting it. No, Paul cannot apologize. He's been so wrong for so long, but Christianity can. I wrote this in a shorter version, submitted it to various newspapers. No one wanted to pay attention. Maybe I'm wrong. No, I am not wrong. Christianity can and must take responsibility for 2,000 years of wrong. And it must do so in deeds, not just words. But if they don't, the cost will be measured in lives we cannot number. And they may include our own. May these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. I would invite you now to restore a measure of hope with this hymn, having drained all of it from you. But we need to proceed in hope, not just in fear. And God of grace and God of glory is a great prayer to send us into the coming days. on the edge of the river of Jordan, there stood Moses talking to the children of Israel and concluded his remarks before he died saying, I call heaven and earth to witness today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life that you and your descendants may live. Let us choose life and all that it requires of us, remembering that this day and every day is a day which the Lord has made. Let us ever rejoice and be glad in it. Amen.